Can you tell me a little about the work you're presenting for the Age of Catastrophe, the work at the actual gallery, the one showing with Kevin Raxworthy, the interesting research on quantum spin?
The exhibition piece, Quantum Consciousness, is an attempt to explore a relationship, an analogous relationship to thought. So what I'm trying to do is start to show how evidence of the newly developing quantum computer is going to be seen, experienced, and potentially the effect that it might have on us as humans. So fundamentally, at a quantum level, they're attempting to control and actuate the spin of an electron. And they're doing this by exciting it once they've captured it in a solid state with microwave signals. And this is like, if you imagine how your thinking comes into being, you're stimulated by the environment, and the environment gets you to think to some extent. You respond to it. In this context, the electron is responding to microwaves, and it spins into all possible states. But then these states are then recorded as either up or down states, just like a simple computer, like a binary computer, which is either on or off. But these have 4 states. They're up, up, down, down, up, down, or down, up. So they can be in 4 states. When these get entangled together, they become a highly complex network of data processing. So this is where they imagine that they're going to get the power from for these quantum computers. So the piece asks questions: will this quantum computer potentially rival human capacity for thought? Will it surpass human capacity for thought? Would it start to develop its own consciousness? Because you're using the same fundamental atoms that you also have in your body. So the same atomic structure that you're made out of, the quantum computer's made out of. So it starts to draw these analogous relationships to us as humans, the materiality of being human, and the materiality of thought.
Interesting. So in your artistic career, spanning several decades, you've focused on interactive computer art, electronic art, cybernetic art, telematic, robotic, nano art, on quantum art here in Winnipeg. So, I mean, you're very engaged in the interaction of biological and technological systems. Can you summarize the concepts you've historically engaged with in your art?
It's really been my artistic career has really been a process of practice-led research to a great extent. To some extent, some of the things I thought when I was first developing artwork as a young student, I suddenly realize now that the questions I was asking then, I'm actually asking now, but I didn't really understand at that point the importance of the questions. They were just things that were happening as you were making. You were going, I wonder what if I did this when I'm making. And now these things have become a lot more important. So fundamentally, my investigations have been, to some extent, myself in relationship to the space around me, and the physicality and the embodiment of being in space. And this space has gradually, from moving from the UK to Australia, where suddenly I was confronted with myself with a completely foreign space and understanding how I engage in that space, my investigation has slowly, microscopically, scale has inverted, and I've started to become much more interested in the much more, let's say, inner workings of scale. So imagine that you keep looking at something and getting closer and closer until your eye touches it, and then the sight goes inwards. So I started off like exploring emptiness in Perth. The emptiness led me to certain understandings of space, and I started to become fascinated by verandas. I mean, this sounds... But between the private space of the home and the public space, I had a really aversion to verandas. I don't like being on verandas, I don't like being seen on verandas, and I don't like seeing people from verandas, because I feel exposed, vulnerable. And I didn't understand why in Australia I felt so strange about them. But I felt that abstract fetishized space of the veranda was often cluttered with things from people's thoughts and so on, and presented a very strange image to the street of what people thought about. And so then I became fascinated about boundaries and the space between buildings. And if you think of buildings as a series of sentences, and then you think of the space between as the pause, as I'm pausing between words, then you see the pause as being really significant. And so I started to look at the boundaries between buildings as being really significant. So now I've gone from the veranda to the boundary between a building, which is often a very small gap. And then I started to become very interested about the space between our skin then and our clothes. And I started to record lots of inner spaces. And then I started to become interested about how much of us are part of the world around us. So when our clothes are on us, how much of us are part of the clothes and how much of the clothes are part of us. And then it led me further and further to asking more questions about embodiment. And so when I did the work Midas, where I grew skin cells and used an atomic force microscope to touch at an atomic level how much of us were part of the environment, and Midas, because of the King Midas and his desire to have gold and touch, leads you to start to think of that idea of pollution, through touch. So everything he touched turned to gold, so he couldn't eat, he couldn't hug his kids or anything like that, and so something like that becomes a curse, which in nanotechnological rhetoric is like Eric Drexler, who wrote The Engines of Creation about nanotechnology, put out the concept of grey goo, which was if we break the bonds of the atoms that hold us together, so if we break that fabric, then we'd all turn into mush. So playing around with that started to sort of also maybe be critical of nanotechnology, because it starts to suggest that we have the ability to sort of construct nature atom by atom. So if you can construct nature by atom, where does life exist in that context? So where do we actually find life evolving? And hence the work Nanoessence, which was scanning a skin cell in vitro with an AFM until it expired. And each time you do a scan, you do like a topography, like a layer. And this layer is in 3D, and so with having 12 layers, I created an envelope of space. And by putting that into a game engine, you could fly into this space. In other words, you could fly into the space between life and death. And then using your breath as an interface, you could grow little cellular automatons within that space. And once you stop breathing on it, these cellular automatons would die. So you're starting to realize the sort of Christian biblical notion that God was the first nanoassembler. So he was the first, because he made man out of dust. But the guy was useless. I mean, he's just like a blob of dust, So the only way that God could get him to do anything was to breathe into Adam's nose. And in breathing into it, so it suggests that life has to be transmitted, it can't be grown. Now, I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying these are interesting concepts about whether life needs to be transmitted. Anyway, this has led me, and then this led me more into the molecular structure of being, and this led me into consciousness and the current thinking of philosophy and physics, and the relationship between those things.
Does the fact that you work in Australia have any specific context with your work?
Travelling to Western Australia from the UK, and it being a colony, so a Commonwealth country, I found it really quite complicated, partly because there was a sense of ownership of it when you first got there, even though you got into a tube, you flew right across the world, and suddenly you get off and everybody drives on the right side of the road, all the signs are the same, everybody is roughly talking the same way, even, you go to shopping centres and everybody's talking with the North of England accent, and you find this as though if you're in England and you go across to France, let's say, which is just across the water, everybody speaks different, it's a completely different culture. So, but things were slightly different, things were slightly odd. They weren't exactly the same as the UK. There was this desire almost to be American, but not necessarily the confidence to be American. So you had this strange kind of mix of cultures going on, but they were like a conjurer's trick. It was almost like you were an illusion. In England, we were brought up on Marmite. In Australia, you have Vegemite. Yeah. And it's like there's two different things, and you go, oh, they're the same, but they're not the same. So all the time you're living in this kind of strange land between things. And I did an awful lot of work on this. I did a lot of work on the fact that I was denying I was existing there. I was looking at a lot of the symbolisms of, English rose gardens and stuff, which, there's a lot of. And the fact that culture can't survive there in that same sense unless it's fertilized. So this whole notion of fertilizing culture to sustain culture. And once you take the fertilizer away, of course, the heat just kills it straight away. So this seemed to become an interesting metaphor for art in Western Australia, that it was very focused on what was happening elsewhere. It was shifting. It wasn't mediating with the environment and so on and so forth. And to some extent, it was patronizing without you actually knowing you were patronizing, if you know what I mean. So then when I was doing the veranda piece, and I suddenly realized that the veranda piece I was doing was also looking away from the home. That when you stand on a veranda, you're actually not looking at the home, you're looking away from it. And that it's usually off the ground a little bit. I mean, I built my own house in Perth, and I built it with a veranda that was on the second floor, so I didn't have to see him. But anyway, the thing came, with that exhibition of that work, I realized that for the first time maybe, and this was after being there for 12, 15 years nearly, that I'd actually was setting foot for the first time, like a Drysdale painting, an Australian painter who paints the veranda, but it's actually the soil. So the veranda is just the covering, and the posts go into the ground, and when you step out, you're actually stepping on terra firma. And I suddenly felt that I wasn't any longer doing this post-colonial view of it, like the way that the early explorers did. They just went out and they saw a mountain and they named it after a king or something, and then they stood on top of it, and then they looked for the next mountain, and so everything else in between was really not for them interesting or interesting enough to be named. It was only the sort of peaks. And it's a strange way to mentally map a country, is to look just for symbols that you either recognize to be similar to England or you name after English kings or something. There's an interesting, very short, by Paul Carter, when he talks about Gray, I think, landing with his boat of people, from the explorer, and he makes his way inland, and he sees an Aboriginal painting on a wall, cave painting, and so he goes back. So at the moment he's going out, he's an explorer. When he's walking back, he's retracing his steps, so he's no longer an explorer.
Yeah.
And then he tells his sailors to come and have a look. And at that moment, he becomes a tour guide in the country. So he brings people and shows them what to see rather than allows them to see for themselves. And it's very much that, the colonizer then becomes colonized again by somebody else coming and showing them to some extent what to do, how to see the world.
Yeah. So in that context, would you say that your first breakthrough exhibition happened in Australia or somewhere else?
No, in Australia, yeah. Well, these things are not... they're more breakthrough moments for me in practice, not necessarily through exhibition. It's not like they're things that they're moments of realization or rupture that change the way that you think and feel about the world. Because you realize that to some extent you've been making mistakes, serious mistakes, about the way you engage in the country and the way that you look at it and the way your gaze overwrites, let's say, what you're actually seeing. And that sort of concept is very prevalent to the things I'm exploring now with quantum, about the way that the world comes into existence when we see it, and at all other times it's in chaos.
Yeah, very often it is about science and art in your case, and probably one of the artists mostly engaged in this area would be yourself. So what would you say is the most radical exhibition that you've taken part in or created, conceptualized?
This is a difficult...
And you're not a radical person, so that's why I'm asking it.
Well, it's not... For me, it's never been about... it's very hard to let's say, to make art that in some sense is, let's say, radical or radicalized, in the sense that how long does it take for art to actually message? So what's the temporality of art? How long does it take for a work of art to shift people or to shift things in the way that people think? I mean, and what does change the way that people think? I've always been interested in developing an aesthetic, and the aesthetic hopefully draws people into a longer discourse. It's like going and seeing something and developing some relationship to it. So I'm not answering your question very well. One of the things that made a big difference for me was I developed an exhibition in 2002, and that exhibition was had a number of artists come.
Is it the BEEP?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Biennale of Electronic Arts in Perth, right?
Yeah, and having those artists all come to Perth was really big for me.
I had a text there. I didn't arrive, but because I wasn't in Australia yet. But you accepted my text for the conference. It was published.
Oh, right.
See, Robbie.
God, aren't I nice?
Yeah.
I can't believe that now.
Well.
But it was but it was having all those people there, and the collaborative kind of contribution to everybody. And at that moment, Shah Davis' work I was showing, and her work made a huge impact on me, on the way that you think, and the relationship between perception. And I was doing my PhD at the time, and when I saw her work, and I shifted my whole PhD to be around her and a comparative study between her and Minimalism, which was so I've always been just directed by a fascination with things. And I've never really worried about... I didn't really start exhibiting at all until like 96. I used to do everything in publications and just mail them out in inconspicuous little things, and because I was very interested in that notion of filtering, that you drop something in somewhere, like you drop something in a letterbox and somebody opens it and they throw it away, or they tear a bit out, or they put a bit on the fridge. I mean, just interested in every reaction is a reaction and an action.
Well, you mentioned, things being evaluated, and so do you believe that your work as an artist has been criticized adequately? Because critics can be unsympathetic to artists, right? And have you felt that some of the criticism you got in your career was undeserved and hostile?
I'm a bit, I'm overly sensitive to criticism, so I'm not very good with criticism, because they're just the sort of personality I am, and therefore when every time you put something out into the world, you feel really vulnerable, because it's just the way that you are. And when I write, because I've written a book now, which is really hard for me to do because I'm fundamentally dyslexic. I can't spell, and it's hard for me to put sentences together. I might be able to say them, but when it comes to writing them, it's a totally different thing. And so every time once I did my book, I wouldn't read it. If I write an article, I won't read it again after it's printed, because I'm too scared of finding mistakes, or people thinking that it's puerile or overly simplistic, and I've never found that happen, but that's what I feel inside, so I've never had come out saying, oh, that's puerile. In fact, I find there's little critical response to work. On the whole, I find criticism to be almost absent in most cases. I wish artists would get together and be more critical together, rather than necessarily judgmental, but have time to do deep readings or close readings of artwork to actually start to see what's... So if we were to ask you the question, because we're in Winnipeg, and you've put the exhibition on in Winnipeg, what's the key things that are coming out of the investigation of artists in Winnipeg? In other words, what's the concern? What's the driver? If there was a style, what would be the style that was emerging that they were actually... Or is there no style? Is there no critique? Is there no critique of a kind of cultural... Is there just an iterative loop of kind of metaphorical associations of painting from the modernist period?
I would call the style here prairie minimalism.
Well,
no, really, because once when you come to a new, new country, new surrounding, new area, new sensibilities, you're kind of able to detect this in the first few months, and that's what came to me. I saw a series of films and videos. And I have never seen it anywhere else. Such prevalence of minimalistic practices.
Yeah.
But yet the artists were unaware of that. They were not thinking that they're particularly minimalist. But in my mind, it kind of folded like that.
No, I could see that. I mean, I think that that's a very dominant. When you come here, that sort of flatness is quite prevalent, and you'd think that it would be a driver, but then and then how does it get translated, and how do people experience flatness, and then how do people then express it? Because the sort of linear horizon line is a very perspectival way of dealing with flatness, and it's a very historical model. So are we challenging it, or are we just accepting it? And if we're just accepting it, then what's it saying about anything?
I think it's incorporating it. I think it's incorporating within the practices and within the
Absolutely,
life, right?
but it comes to a point where it either dominates the practice, or there's no critical reflection on it as an iconic line.
Yeah, I think it's both of them together wrapped up. So my next question is about leadership. It's a funny question, but but there have to be leaders in certain fields, including the arts. And you have certainly been a leader in Western Australia, in Australia, by setting up these conferences, setting up collaborations, doing book projects, exhibitions, etc. So, can you describe the perception of the experience of providing leadership in the art world, if you feel that this is the case? Is it important at all? And then the follow-up question would be about collaborative practices, because all of your leadership is within collaborative practices. So can you give me an answer by providing...
It's a tricky question, leadership. Because I think that leadership sounds very definitive, like you're just telling people what to do, and this is certainly not.
By leadership, let me just say what I understand by leadership. It would be vision implemented in action.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm really passionate about some of the things in relationship to art, and I want to share them. I can't help it. I just want to share some of the things that I feel and think. And so when I started the Beeps, let's say, it was very much that I wanted Western Australia to experience some of the things that were happening that was so dynamic and so exciting within the area of electronic arts that I wanted to try and stimulate. And you couldn't stimulate this by just going into a class and saying there's lots of good stuff in electronic arts. You had to bring it. You had to make it tangible and experiential. And I was lucky enough to have met some really interesting people and invite them along, and then you create this kind of bubble which is like a thought bubble. And it's, what if we could make this exhibition happen? What would we need to do? And then you start to bring other people together. And then I started to work with Oren Katz from Symbiotica, because he was living in Perth at the same time, and Symbiotica had just started, and they've done their first 3 projects. And so this then became bigger, and then getting Roy Ascot from the UK to agree to come, and then it gets bigger. And so the bubble, and then it starts to cost money. And everybody's saying, well, where are you going to get money from to make this happen? And money just started to happen slowly. Certain people got grants. We got a small grant. Symbiotica got a grant. And then it starts.
Like an alchemy, right?
Yeah. But it's like a belief. It's like a belief that it can happen. And you have to sort of feed that all the time, that conscious bubble. And that's what exhausts you. It's not like I'm a person that's a good organizer, because I'm not. I'm not an administrator. It's too complex. I can't even choose breakfast. So to organize something is, and to make those, but to have a belief that something should happen, and then to encourage people, and then you find that there's great people to help you. They just are there, and you didn't know that they were there, but then they're there, and they do a job that is just amazing. And that's what makes it happen, because they've bought in to this idea, and that's what you supply. You supply the belief in the concept that this should happen. And sometimes you don't really know you're doing that at the time until on reflection you say, well, what did I actually contribute to this? And it was just this, talking it up with government, talking it up with people, being very passionate about what the potential was in Western Australia. I wanted Perth in 2004 to be completely wireless and a digital city, because being so isolated, it was the perfect vehicle for seeing how society would function. It's got the largest sector, I think, of retired engineers. And I mean, what would a series of retired engineers do if they were all free on wireless? It would just be, I wanted Perth to be augmented reality at that time in 2004. So you'd go into Perth and every building would have tags on it that would actually talk about Perth. So people coming in would just, anyway, it obviously didn't happen. But I had a map on the front of the website, which is a map of Western Australia, and I wanted to link into the State Energy Commission. So, how they have the circuits of how all the electricity is going around the state. And so wherever it was having a black spot, there would be no electronic art happening there.
Oh, okay.
So I thought it would be a really beautiful kind of analogy on the front, but I couldn't even get that. I mean, it's hard working with state government things to make things happen.
Although in Perth, I was really impressed by the hydrogen buses.
Yeah.
Back then, it was like probably the only city outside of.
Well, they make so much pollution. One concession is not.
Yes. So, but are you satisfied with the general level of art science collaborations today? As that's what you're working with.
Art science has really taken over, I think, from what was media art I think it always was art and science, but I think media art became a strange diversion for a while, following the CPU kind of dream of very high-speed computing. But a lot of the networking and stuff, the networking has become just very mimetic. It's just what we put in. We've created it. We've put in the information, and now we're just suffering from very sophisticated algorithms telling us, that these are our choices, and something you think, well, so it's really telling us what we like rather than us now.
Yeah.
And it's a very strange switch around. But I think art and science on the whole is a fundamental, too simplistic a binary, and I think they talk about it as a binary, and they talk about scientific methodologies and so on. And I'm maybe more interested in undisciplinary art and art that doesn't necessarily follow. I like to collaborate because fundamentally I need to collaborate because I don't have all these skills. But I think we should be critical. Art shouldn't have to follow any rules. It shouldn't have to know everything about science, so you don't have to, you shouldn't have to know everything about philosophy. There might be one line that you think is the line that just captures you and is inspirational. It doesn't mean to say you have to know everything about that.
Yeah.
So there's this, so I prefer art, science and culture as a concept rather than just art and science.
So are you interested in recognition by the scientific circles? Some artists are. Do you think that your experiments have been recognized there within the scientific circles? Is there a possibility of improvement of these collaboration models which we have today in
well, I think that there
arts and sciences? I
think there's obviously I would love to think that there's recognition of certain things that happen, but I don't really think, data visualization, let's just say for example, the whole thing now, the whole hype about, science, business, having their huge bodies of big data suddenly put into visual representations to find new meanings, as though they're creating a new visual language or something. And then you think of Cézanne sitting there painting nature, which is a huge database. Nature is just like, oh my God. How do you just construct what is fundamentally a living entity at the same time, atmospheric? So the processing all that and then coming up with that and being really maybe the father of a kind of abstraction that develops over years from big data sets through to minimalist kind of abstractions of big data. And then they suddenly come up with big data. And you say, well, wait a minute, haven't you recognized that art's been doing this for an awfully long time? And shouldn't you sort of draw some parallels? But no, it's new. So it's not a friendly world for recognition in that context. Everybody wants to be the one that's recognized, and only a few people will be. The bioarts, it's been, there'll be a few significant people that will be recognized. But there will have been people working before in biological work that won't be so recognized, and there'll be people coming up afterwards, might be as good or equally as good as not as good, but there are only a few that can be recognized, and there's only a few that the marketplace will want. But everybody has to be contributing for these things to happen. And so, yeah, I'd love to be recognized. I have an ego like everybody else, but it's frustrating when you're working in an area and your work gets ignored in relationship to other people, but it's just par for the course.
Yeah, and very often it's two cultures, right?
Yeah.
Even well, we don't have to go as back as C.P. Snow's,
Yeah.
Two Cultures text, but it is. I remember Laura Chinty's project. Remember when it got published on the cover of the Scientific American with the hairy cactus?
Yeah.
It was obviously an artistic imagination, but it got published on the cover because they thought the project had happened in reality.
Yeah.
So for the scientific field as a whole, the idea was accomplishing a hairy cactus, inserting, or somehow, making the cactus grow human hair. But on the other hand, for the artist, it's a completely different understanding, a different take on it. It could be a critical take on it. It could be anything. And so, is there? I mean, like, have those two worlds somehow, because of all of these collaborations, began to understand each other more and more. I mean, your collaboration with Kevin Ragsworthy, Gary Cass, not to speak of Stuart Bunt. These are all people that have incorporated also artistic models of the humanities, and yet they're scientists. So their world has expanded dramatically.
I think so, but I think that there's still a lot of difference between quantitative outcomes and qualitative outcomes, and I think there was a lot of fear that their research would be tainted, that if they were going in for qualitative research, they wouldn't get funding for their science, and so they have to be protective to some extent. But I'm interested in non-specific outcomes. I'm interested in outcomes that don't have to sum up to anything in particular, apart from an experience, an aesthetic experience. And even aesthetics is a tricky word. I think science sometimes has a view of outsourcing the ideas and what do they call it when you're showcasing science to the public. So they want artists to be able to, and sometimes they mistake artists for designers, as though you're suddenly going to do a fantastic graphic illustration of atoms crashing together or something like that, and so they want to get a public face for the science, and they see art as being a vehicle for doing that. I see taking scientific kind of ideas and putting them into the humanities is good because it puts a different critical discourse, but I wish there was more critical discourse of it rather than a legitimization of art by science, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, you're correct to say that moist art or nano art or any other media art is, after all, an artistic and aesthetic experience. But does it provide any specific metaphors that you use and you would like to share? Like, what are the metaphors of this experience?
Well, I think that what bioart showed us was a kind of reconnection with materiality in the body. It brought us really back to the body as a material, and which did link heavily into Stellark's early work and so on, and it started to set the scene, I think, as well for a kind of new materialism to start to, and I think Oren Katz, from the director of Symbiotica, who, when you go there, if you wanted to work there, you have to work with the materiality. I mean, it's very clear. It's not just there to go and write about them or anything. It's there to actually go and work with the material of tissue and so on, which brings you back. And I think that kind of terminology or technology has been really influential in starting to explore our relationship to the world. And my interest is, at the moment, is if an artwork could summarize the world, then what would that world look like? So science is trying to tell us things about the world and explain what the world is like. But if an artwork was to summarize that world, then what would that world be like? Because to some extent it's only a construction. You're constructing this world when you're seeing it now. You're turning it through your gaze from a quantum world to a classical world.
Would you say that Genesis maybe provides such a bridge?
Genesis.
Eduardo Katz's work?
I think that, I've always had a strong feeling that Genesis was one. a singularly interesting piece at the time of work. I mean, more interesting than Transgenic Bunny and stuff like that. But just as a kind of aesthetics signifier of some shift, I thought it was because sometimes you wonder, like, if you could jump like 30 years from now, like if there's a masterpiece, and if there is a masterpiece of, let's say, bioart, then what is the masterpiece? Is it like the Worry Dolls, or is it? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like because everybody loves the kind of idea that there's a singular thing that was the actual rupture that made us aware. And I like the notion that I also like the problem that bioart brought to aesthetics. I think it is a fundamentally really interesting, because of the amount of technology that you need to sustain semi-living works.
Yeah.
And how you aesthetic. It's like the early days, when you used to do video art, and they used to want to install video art, and you'd have these big TV cameras, TV sets, and people used to try and disguise them by sticking things over them or something like that. And it's like, where's the art in this? Because if the art's in the set, then the screen is the frame and so on, and we're being immersed in what's going on. Once you start to put the tools, the hypermediation, as Jens would call it, or of these tools, then...
I agree. Bioart does provide, additional questioning of the concepts, as was the case with NORC, right? Like a whole problem of taxonomy. Suddenly there is this, you can't actually follow the lineage. There are these new organisms, some of them semi-living, and it gets completely confusing.
I think it does. I mean, I think Aaron used to talk about, when universities, because you can go online to get cell lines, and when you find that some of the cell lines have been like polluted, it's almost like this chocolate bar doesn't have nuts or does have nuts, and they suddenly have all these ingredients that you never thought were in it, and it happens with things that they want.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, we did this project in Banff. You wouldn't think there were any pollutants, right? But the chemist that worked with us was surprised to find all these elements suddenly in the atmosphere, which shouldn't be there, right? It should be a pristine atmosphere in the mountains, and yet it was, polluted as well.
So it's it's an interesting area, just as with networks, as with the amount of people now in the creative industries who have no necessarily art experience, who are making art in the same way and exhibiting the work, how art's having to actually deal conceptually and aesthetically and critically within this field. So what constitutes that kind of appraisal, and how do we look at that? And it's a wonderful time.
Have you ventured with your work in the field of biopolitics?
No, because
well,
I'm not a very good at politics in the sense, because I have always had a kind of strange feeling that what people say is sometimes a contradictory or fashionable or whatever. It's really the way you live your life, and you're a biopolitical person just by the way you act in the day. And so to turn it into something else, like my artwork is biopolitical by the sheer fact that, I'm trying to make a statement. But I don't make it overt, and I'm not necessarily interested in trying to pick up any particular cause. Causes are problematic in the deceit of certain causes. It's the rationale. If you started to try and understand like a way of living that wasn't harmful to other people and wasn't necessarily as harmful to the environment, then maybe that's not necessarily a cause, it's just maybe a way of life, and that way of life might be more instrumentally better.
Has the role of the arts and artists changed with the obvious advent of info and biotechnologies? Are we also experiencing a transformation of the established values in other areas? And is this situation leading to changes on the cultural front as well? So basically, are we successful at redefining our societies, the political, economic framework, the social structures, etc.?
Through art?
Yeah.
Well, I think I think sometimes we're putting too much on art. We're putting too many layers of importance. I mean, I think, almost stressing that art could solve certain things. I'm not sure that it can.
But if it can't, then it is being influenced by all of the changes, right?
I think that obviously it's being influenced, and I still think the sort of the McLuhan-esque notion of the antenna is still one of my favourites. That if an artist is an actual antenna of the society that it lives in, and that's not just so other people can be antennas, so it's not just this sort of there's only one sort of anyway. Then it's how you draw this in to you, and then how you as the individual or the mediate with that information, and then how you then express it. And it's that expression that I'm interested in. I'm interested in how artists can express the affect of all that information, plus their whole life, plus their knowledge of certain things, into actually trying to visualize something and giving you a present.
Yeah. I mean, it's obvious the themes you work are not only artistic and cultural, but you also touch on many ethical dilemmas. So can you elaborate a bit on the importance of ethics in media art practices, technological art?
Ethics is, I work in a university now, so ethics are highly problematic as well.
You get a set of guidelines, right?
Well, yeah, ethics committee, you can't, there's certain things under universities that you can't do without ethics.
But you're not the only one. There are many of the artists in biotech that work at universities, right?
Yeah. I mean, but in the sense that, doing an interview like this, if you were a university, you would have had to get ethics clearance to do this for a start, and quite serious ethics clearance as well. So, but again, it's where ethics is coming from, and what it's drawing from is the complexity of because to some extent art should be unethical as well. It should confront ethics, as to their validity and what.
Yeah, because ethics changes as well.
Yeah, I mean, these changes based on fashionable things and things that need to be shifted, but it's going back to if you're living your life. Certain things, certain decisions you have to make on the way are going to confront your ethics. But it's trying to make people aware that everybody is responsible for their own ethical attitude towards the world, and it's not something that you can give over to somebody else and that you're not responsible. And this is something that we need to focus more on.
I would like to ask you about interfaces. Yeah, because some see biotech art as a general interface between bioscience and art. So what is your position in general on interfaces in technological art?
My interest in this area has spanned quite a few years, and I think it's the same interest that I have as the early explorers. Here we have something that a kind of spatial, technological, new dimension, let's say. And how do humans interact with it? How are humans meant to interface with it? I mean, was the iPhone or iPad or touchpad, was that really how we're meant to interface with technology? And I think artists have done an awful lot of work in challenging the notions of interfaciality across the whole spectrum. So I think that it was these interfaces are part of a philosophical understanding of our relationship to technologies, and I think that's what makes these, and especially some of the early interfaces, because now we're in a very mimetic, Arduino-based kind of, let's say, more corporate understanding of interfaces, where you can just get things off the shelf, and any sort of data can then drive any sort of machine. But then the problem comes with all this data is it's just a numerical quantification of an experience. And we all know from Bergson that the sort of quantifiable data is not the experience. And you can't mistake the two. And I think a lot of people are mistaking the digital or technological experience as being the experience. And it can't be. It can only be a quantifiable experience, version of that.
Yeah. Now a little bit about art institutions.
Yeah.
We all work, in institutions, and we're influenced by the institutions as well as influence institutions. So are art institutions becoming more open to artists dealing with technology in regard to funding, commissioning, and exhibiting? What are your experiences? Is it a more open, concept now, or?
I think that there's more. It depends what you really mean by media art in this context, because it's grown exponentially and things. I think there are more galleries that are going. The galleries that are opening up about art and science. I think media art was always caught between the cinema experience, and the white cube. I mean, it wanted the dark cube, because galleries always privilege light, and where media art really privileges dark and works through a kind of projected light. So.
Well, I mean, mostly technological art. The sort of art we've been engaging with.
Yeah.
A video pool, like many people ask me about the name, why are we called a video pool? It is because video in 1983 was the most experimental research technology there was accessible to artists.
Yeah.
Of course, this has moved on, and now we're working with robotics, with nanotech, biotech, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's as you say, it's branched out in many fields. But have the arts institutions, like the art galleries, museums, have become more open or not? They have become more open for video. We could see 30 years ago.
We can see that because the reliability, the durability of the technology is not questionable. I mean, you know how long a lifespan a projector is. If you want this work and you want it curated, you know that you can do it for 5 years on 5 projectors, which each have enough power for lumens to last this long. You know the history. You know what's going to happen. Whereas before, you wouldn't even know if it's going to play.
Yeah.
So it's become commoditized. I mean, I think the bioarts has shown the difficulty that institutions have had with semi-living organisms in a collection where, what's in the air could pollute the work. But even on, we all know that this is not necessarily true in the sense that there are a lot of organisms coming in all the time, and at a nanoscale, you can't have filters to filter out organisms.
Well, I remember having to get clearance from the quarantine when I was exhibiting Eduardo Katz's work.
Yeah.
In Australia, at the Experimental Art Foundation. But I mean, there are ways of going around it so that you can actually show the work. But
I heard a story that might or might not be true. So this is a disclaimer up front. But it was a nice story. It was about Craig Martin's. This is an oak tree, or this is not an oak tree. Somebody who can define the title, whether it was. But anyway. It evidently didn't get into Australia through customs. Do you know the work? It's just a glass shelf with a water on it. But Australian customs wouldn't let it in because they thought, because you can't bring vegetables or things in. So it's not even quarantine. It's conceptual that they quarantine. So they quarantined an idea, if you know what I mean. And I find this.
But that is similar to Günther von Hagen's. Remember. the process of plastination, right?
Yeah.
And basically he had to go through a whole system where the corpses are not considered as people anymore after they are, plastinated, plastified.
But this whole concept of categorization and the artwork, and all I'm saying is that galleries are being confronted by this. What was the one in the UK? Was it GV Art, who had the first license?
Oh yeah. Robert Nifchich, GV Art,
yeah. The first license to show living tissue, or human tissue, I think, or tissue, within a commercial gallery situation. So there's a lot of rules out there about what people can show, but when you think of some of the early performance art that went on, you think of the sort of Nietzsche performances and
the Viennese actualists.
Yeah, I mean, you go, wow.
Karol Schneemann.
Yeah, how could have? I mean, you couldn't even get something like this happening anywhere anymore.
Today,
So I don't think it's just media art and such. I mean, media art to some extent could be seen to be ghettoized, or because there's no institutions. But when you look at the amount of people that are making art in the sense of institutionally recognized art for the institutionally recognized art market, it's huge. And if you look at media art, it's quite tiny, comparative.
We still haven't made the leap.
No, well, I mean, I think to some extent artists have leapt out.
Yeah.
If you understand what I mean, they don't consider themselves media artists; they're just artists.
Yeah.
You've got Lozano Hema. Is he a media artist or an artist? You would just say he's an artist.
Well, of course, like they're all artists because it has been incorporated in the art
But all I'm
system.
saying is that some people have categorized themselves, their work as media art, and to some extent they now categorize themselves work as just art. So the tag of media art has started to lose some of the, let's say, credibility that it might have had at one time when you were an explorer of that medium, to the ubiquity that technology is now, where you're no longer, you're just using it as part of a palette of tools to express oneself.
Well, like the guy you mentioned at the beginning, he was an explorer, but then he became a tourist guide.
Yeah, that's right.
Or like a curator,
Yeah.
taking his friends to look at what he's discovered. But where do you see the biggest experiment in art happening today?
Biggest experiment in art. That would be a question I think I ask a lot. Like, where are the things that, and to some extent, the biggest questions are being asked are the kind of invisible things that are happening. And the reason I say that is because every time you see something, you go to a gallery and you see works, you recognize them because you already have them in your head. They're already known to you to some extent. They're familiar. And then suddenly you come across something that you sort of shocks you into a way of, and I don't mean shocked by the horror of it or anything like that. I just mean shocked you because you can't conceive that was actually art.
Yeah, well, as Bergson says, for any new phenomena, we have to develop a new way of thinking.
Absolutely.
And, we're not really ready for that.
Yeah, and so a lot of the art that's actually is that new phenomenon that we actually can't see yet. We're a bit, and suddenly somebody has the potential to say, oh, look, and when they do that, then everybody sees it.
Yeah.
And so I think but that's what I'm always looking for. I'm always looking for that thing when I go to galleries that go, oh my God, that really stretches the way that I think and see. I don't have any criteria for this work. And suddenly I'm reject it almost instantly, but in that same way I accept it just because I've rejected it. Once I see something I like, I really dislike it because I like it, because it's just reaffirming my taste, and there's something that's, I want more than just a re-information a reconfirmation of my own taste. I want something else.
Yeah. So let's keep that thought a bit. Not having criteria for evaluating a certain work of art, or being disoriented, or just getting something new in your understanding of the world, and having to pause a bit about it. But there are many such objects, right? It's a big planet. But we have a Western art canon, right? So would you say that the validation according to the Western art canon is still important for the art or technological art? Is it still important, or because we have so many new influxes, Chinese art, art coming from...
I think it's, like validation is a tricky, because you're going to ask the question straight away, who's the person that can validate anything?
Well, there's the market, there's academia, there's...
But as we say, that these things fluctuate up and down, so time is sometimes quite good at validating. I mean, it's done quite well historically of pointing out certain key moments in time.
I mean, Roy Ascott says the East is the New West, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, you would think that there is a dramatic change of the Western art canon, but I can't see that yet. So that's why I'm asking you.
Well, for me, there's kind of various families, right? And you kind of join a family, and that family has a lineage. And it's maybe different to another family, but not hugely different. It's just, there's just a sort of like-mindedness. Hopefully not a stubborn like-mindedness, but a like-mindedness, which you relate to. And you can't help relating to it, because it's the way you are, to some extent. You're trying to change the way you are, but, I mean, I realized I was really interested in conceptualism for a long time. And I was completely anti-formalism. But after a while, I realized that certain aesthetic values, or certain aesthetics, kept reappearing in my work. And even though I tried to put words all over them to try and obliterate them and conceptualize them, they still persisted. And then suddenly I realized, when I was making a video once, and I was putting it together through these translucent sort of veils of video, that I actually really loved that aesthetic. And it was me. It was my aesthetic, and I really enjoyed it. And even though I want to stretch it, that part of you has to own some of the things that you are, and whether it has relationships to other art forms or mystical art forms, or whether you could relate the sort of, in a way, other cultural forms to it is really not that important. I mean, because we're all part of a human species, and we all do artwork with the attributes, the tools that we have as humans, and they're not limitless. I mean, people still think that. I mean, so as a functioning sentient being, we've all got very similar things. We might think slightly differently, but I don't think there's huge variations in that. And
well, thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the longest 10 questions I've ever heard in my life.